Something didn't feel right the moment the palace moved. Not a statement, not a warning, not even a denial. Just action. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And here's the question nobody is asking loudly enough yet. Why would King Charles and Prince William risk a public backlash, reopen old wounds, and reignite global controversy unless something far more dangerous had already surfaced? Because this wasn't about feelings. This wasn't about interviews. And it definitely wasn't about old grudges. This was about money. Hidden money. And when money starts moving in places it shouldn't, even royalty stops pretending everything is fine. Let me ask you this. If everything was clean, if everything was transparent, if the palace had nothing to fear, why act now? Why slash titles quietly, decisively, and without the usual months of preparation? Why involve William directly instead of letting the decision disappear behind palace protocol? That timing matters. Because just days before this decision, whispers started circulating inside royal financial circles. Not tabloids, not bloggers, people whose job it is to notice patterns. Small ones, repetitions, numbers that don't quite line up. At first, it looked harmless, almost boring. A routine financial review. The kind of thing that happens all the time when royal affiliations, foundations, and international interests overlap. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, until something appeared that wasn't supposed to exist at all. An account that had never been disclosed. An account that didn't match public timelines. An account that raised one terrifying question inside palace walls. Who knew about this? And who didn't? Here's where the story turns uncomfortable. Royal titles are not ceremonial decorations. They are access passes, shields, keys. They grant credibility in rooms where deals are whispered, not announced. They open doors long before anyone asks questions. And if a title is being used while financial activity happens beyond royal oversight, that's not embarrassing. That's dangerous. And suddenly, the palace wasn't dealing with a family disagreement anymore. It was dealing with potential institutional exposure. The kind that doesn't fade with a press cycle. The kind that forces action whether anyone likes it or not. Think about it. Why not deny it? Why not delay? Why not let lawyers bury it in paperwork? Because delay would look like permission. And that's when everything changed. According to insiders, the mood inside the palace shifted fast. Calm turned into concern. Concern into urgency. And urgency into a single unavoidable conclusion. Something had to be cut off immediately. Not discussed. Not negotiated. Cut. So when the decision came down to strip Meghan's royal titles, it wasn't symbolic. It was surgical. A containment move. A line drawn between royal authority and something the crown wanted no part of. But here's the part that should make you pause. The account wasn't dormant. It wasn't old. And it wasn't small. And the moment William asked who authorized it, the room went quiet. Because no one had an answer. What if the most dangerous detail wasn't the amount of money, but the silence around it? Because once the question was asked, there was no going back. Who authorized it? That single sentence changed the atmosphere in the room. Not because someone refused to answer, but because no one could. Papers were checked. Names were scanned. Approval chains were retraced again and again. And every path led to the same dead end. Nothing. No signature. No recorded consent. No official acknowledgement. And that's when the realization hit. This account didn't exist by accident. It existed by design. Here's something most people don't understand about royal finances. There is structure layered on top of structure. Redundancies. Safeguards. Oversight mechanisms specifically created to prevent exactly this kind of thing. So for something to slip through, it doesn't just mean someone missed it. It means it was placed carefully enough to avoid detection. Ask yourself this. How do you hide something in the most monitored financial ecosystem in the world? You don't hide it loudly. You don't move it recklessly. You tuck it somewhere it doesn't raise alarms until someone asks the wrong question. And that question had just been asked. What made the discovery even more unsettling wasn't just the account's existence. It was the timing of the activity. Transfers that coincided with moments when public narratives said one thing and financial behavior suggested another. Periods of supposed separation from royal influence that didn't match the access the title still quietly provided. That contradiction matters, because it creates a gap, and gaps are where investigators live. Inside palace circles, concern quickly turned into something sharper. Fear. Not the dramatic kind. The controlled, professional kind. The kind that comes when you realize this isn't about public embarrassment anymore. It's about exposure. Think about the optics. A duchess publicly distancing herself from the institution, while privately benefiting from the authority the institution provides. That's not just ironic. That's combustible. And suddenly, every previous decision was being re-examined through a new lens. Past approvals, past allowances, past assumptions. What had been granted in good faith now felt naive. This is where the emotional shift happened. Because betrayal inside a family hurts. But betrayal inside a system threatens survival. Insiders describe a moment where the conversation stopped being polite. The tone changed. Not angry, focused, efficient. The kind of mood where people stop speculating and start calculating outcomes. And that's when the comparison was made. This wasn't about punishing someone. It was about cutting a live wire before it burned the house down. Titles, in that moment, stopped being honors. They became liabilities. And here's the twist most people missed. The palace didn't move because it had all the answers. It moved because it didn't. Because uncertainty, combined with authority, is more dangerous than scandal. So the decision was made fast. Not announced loudly. Not celebrated. Executed. But the most telling detail came after. Because once the titles were slashed, the question wasn't what had already been found. It was what else might surface now that the shield was gone. And that's when William stepped forward. Not as a son, not as a brother-in-law, but as the future king who understood one brutal truth. If this wasn't stopped here, it wouldn't stop itself. So why didn't King Charles slow it down? That's the part that shocked even people inside the palace. Because if there was ever a moment for hesitation, for delay, for a carefully worded pause, this was it. A reigning monarch stepping back, while his heir pushes forward, is not something that happens casually. It signals agreement. Or worse, necessity. And here's the uncomfortable truth. By the time William stepped in, the decision had already moved past debate. This wasn't about whether action should be taken. It was about how much damage could still be prevented. Think about what that means. For years, King Charles has been described as cautious, deliberate, almost overly patient. So when he doesn't intervene, when he doesn't insist on softer handling, it tells you something critical. Whatever had been uncovered wasn't just problematic. It was incompatible with delay. William's role changed in that moment. He wasn't the mediator. He wasn't the peacemaker. He was the firewall. And according to those familiar with the discussions, his position was blunt. Titles could not coexist with unanswered financial questions. Not temporarily. Not conditionally. Not while reviews were still ongoing. Because allowing that overlap would mean the crown was knowingly permitting influence without accountability. That's a line no future king wants to explain. Here's where the emotional contradiction hits hard. Publicly, Meghan's narrative has long centered on control, restriction, and lack of autonomy. But privately, the palace was now facing evidence that autonomy may have extended further than anyone realized. Further, and without oversight. Ask yourself this. If someone claims they were trapped, but their reach was still active, still operational, still quietly effective, how does that change the story? Inside the room, that question lingered, and it created something dangerous. Doubt. Not about feelings. About facts. Every previous concession was now being reinterpreted. Every benefit questioned. Every protection reevaluated. The tone wasn't emotional anymore. It was clinical. Titles were no longer symbols of belonging. They were risks with names attached. And this is where King Charles's silence mattered most. Because silence, at that level, isn't avoidance. It's permission. By allowing William to lead, Charles sent a signal internally that the crown's future mattered more than optics today. That the institution would survive this moment even if individuals didn't like the outcome. So when the final recommendation was presented, it wasn't dramatic. It was efficient. Titles removed. Distance established. Authority separated from unresolved financial activity. No speeches. No explanations. Just action. But here's the part that hasn't been discussed enough. Removing titles doesn't erase history. It doesn't close books. It opens them. Once the shield is gone, questions don't disappear. They multiply. Because now, every transfer, every connection, every unexplained alignment becomes fair game. Not just internally, externally. And that's what truly changed everything. Because the palace didn't just cut ties. It removed protection. And the moment that happened, attention shifted to one terrifying possibility. What if the account wasn't the end of the trail? What if it was just the first thing that slipped? What happens when the shield disappears? That's the question no one inside the palace wanted to ask out loud, but everyone was already thinking. Because once titles are gone, so is the buffer, the distance, the polite hesitation that keeps deeper questions at bay. And that's when the tone shifted again. Not panic, preparation. Because now, the concern wasn't just what had already been discovered. It was what the discovery might attract. Scrutiny has a way of snowballing. One inconsistency invites another set of eyes, another request, another comparison of timelines that were never meant to be aligned. Here's where the irony becomes impossible to ignore. For years, the palace was accused of being controlling, overly rigid, obsessed with optics. And yet, the very restraint that once protected everyone may have allowed something to operate quietly in the background. Not out of malice, out of assumption. Assumption that boundaries were respected. Assumption that disclosures were complete. Assumption that autonomy didn't extend beyond what was agreed. Those assumptions were now gone. Insiders say the phrase that started circulating wasn't accusation. It was process. We need to understand exposure. Exposure doesn't mean guilt. It means vulnerability. It means figuring out where influence ends and where liability begins. And that's where the broader consequences came into focus. Because titles aren't just labels. They connect individuals to an institution with centuries of history, legal complexity, and international recognition. When financial activity intersects with that recognition, even indirectly, it creates obligations, questions, potential explanations that the crown is suddenly responsible for. That responsibility is what forced the next phase. Not public, not loud, but comprehensive. Timelines were laid out side by side. Public statements, private movements, access points, moments where doors opened because of a name, not a person. The picture that formed wasn't dramatic in the way tabloids love. It was worse. It was inconsistent. And inconsistency is the one thing institutions cannot tolerate. Ask yourself this. If nothing else had ever surfaced, would this have happened? Probably not. But once one anomaly appears, ignoring it becomes a decision. And decisions have consequences. That's why the palace didn't issue a long explanation. Explaining invites debate. Debate invites delay. Delay invites more exposure. So instead, they drew a boundary and moved on. But the public reaction wasn't what worried them most. It was what might come next. Because once authority is formally withdrawn, third parties no longer have to defer. They don't have to tread carefully. They don't have to wait for palace permission. And that opens a door that cannot be closed quietly. This is the part where narratives break. Supporters see persecution. Critics see vindication. Neutral observers start asking the questions everyone else avoided. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, the truth becomes harder to control. Which brings us to the most unsettling detail of all. The palace didn't just remove titles. It began preparing for follow-up. Because the real danger was never the account itself. It was what it might connect to once people started looking without restraint. And according to those closest to the situation, that next phase was already being discussed before the public even noticed what had changed. Because when money leaves a trail, it rarely walks alone. And what they feared finding next could make this moment look small by comparison. So when people ask whether this was justice or overreaction, they're missing the point. Because this moment was never about punishment. It was about survival. Institutions don't act emotionally. They act defensively. And when an institution as old and exposed as the monarchy makes a move this decisive, it's not responding to headlines. It's responding to risk. Go back to the beginning of this story. The quiet discovery. The unanswered question. The sudden urgency. None of that looks like a family feud spiraling out of control. It looks like a system realizing it no longer understands every moving part connected to its name. And that's terrifying. For years, narratives collided. Control versus freedom. Tradition versus independence. Victim versus villain. But money doesn't care about narratives. It leaves timestamps, trails, patterns. And when those patterns don't match the story being told publicly, the story starts to unravel on its own. That's why the titles mattered so much. Because titles don't just grant prestige. They extend trust. They imply alignment. They suggest that what one does reflects the institution behind the name. Once that implication becomes questionable, the institution has only one choice. It separates. Not loudly, not emotionally, but completely. This wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about limiting the future. And here's the part that should stay with you. Removing titles doesn't end scrutiny. It invites it. Because now, there's no expectation of deference. No hesitation out of respect. No assumption that someone else has already signed off. Every question becomes fair. Every connection becomes relevant. Every inconsistency becomes something someone, somewhere, will want explained. That's the real cost of this moment. Not reputation. Exposure. And whether anything further ever comes out publicly or not, the damage is already done in one critical way. The trust that once allowed benefit without oversight is gone. And trust, once broken, doesn't quietly return. So when you hear people say this came out of nowhere, remember this. Nothing like this ever does. It builds slowly, invisibly, until one small detail refuses to stay hidden, until one routine question doesn't get answered, until the silence becomes louder than any accusation. And then, suddenly, everything changes. The palace drew its line. The shield came down, and the story entered a phase where control is no longer centralized, which means the next revelation, if there is one, won't come from a press release. It will come from someone following a trail that was never meant to be followed all the way to the end. And that's why this story isn't over. It's just no longer protected.